This presentation is titled Safety Interpretation Signs. Warning signs may not be enough. It was presented at the International Trail Summit in Madison, Wisconsin on April 17, 2025. This section is divided into three sections. The first section is the introduction and background. It includes a definition of safety interpretation and Tilden's principles of interpretation. The second section introduces examples of safety interpretation signage and how interpretive signage can facilitate safety. It explains the why. The third section expands upon the basic message. Freeman Tilden is the father of interpretation. A National Park Ranger, his book is titled Interpreting Our Heritage. It presents and expands upon the 6 principles of interpretation. The principles of interpretation are really a substitute for the principles of education. Safety interpretation is defined as a branch of interpretation that utilizes the principles of interpretation to facilitate safety. Regarding Tilden's 6 principles, the message needs to relate to the person receiving the message. It needs to be personalized. The information presented needs to lead to revelation, or that aha moment. People relate to and remember stories. Stories affect all of us. Interpretation is not instruction, but provocation. It is holistic or thematic and age-related. Key to our purposes, safety education explains the why. Tilden's basic interpretive model is through interpretation, understanding. Through understanding, appreciation. And through appreciation, protection of the resource. For us, it is through appreciation, safety. Let me tell you a story from one of the legal cases that has affected me. Had an interpretive sign been present, it might have prevented 2 fatalities. The story is tragic on many dimensions. Ford Dam is on the Huron River near Milford, Michigan. It is part of the Huron River Water Trail, a national water trail. Max is the leader of a canoe outing as part of a church group. The church group utilizes a national organization of his church, which mimics the Boy Scouts. Max's son was on the canoe trip. They rented the canoes from a local outfitter. The outfitter rents canoes to individuals and families. The Ford Dam provides a well-established portage trail. It is equipped with rollers for the canoes, which make for an easy portage of the canoes around the dam. Max's son and another camper portaged to the dam. They decided to paddle up the backwash and touch the back of the dam. Low-head dams create a hydraulic behind them. The water in the hydraulic is flowing back upstream. The perfect hydraulic extends from side to side of the dam. It is a killer, and it is often called the drowning machine. Max's son and the other camper paddled up the backwash, crossed the boil, and attempted to touch the back of the dam. The hydraulic proceeded to recirculate them. Max's son drowned. The other camper flushed out of the hydraulic. But the story doesn't end here. It even gets better. Killingbeck, his real name, a bystander with no relationship to the group, who was a marathon paddler and knew the dangers of a hydraulic, decided to rescue the 2 boys. He paddled his boat into the hydraulic, where he proceeded to drown. His estate sued Max, the leader, who had just lost his son, for negligence. I dropped off the case because of the leadership issues. It was asserted that there should have been 2 leaders on the trip. But the canoe rental didn't tell him this. They rented canoes to individuals and families. The national organization didn't tell him that he needed 2 leaders. He did what he'd always done. Max thought he was doing everything right, and he had no reason to think otherwise. You can see why this is a multidimensional tragedy, However, our focus is on interpretive signage, but that is the rest of the story. The question is, with all the warnings and barriers present, why did Max's son and the other camper paddle up the backwash and touch the back of the dam? We will examine the dam and some of its barriers and warnings that were present on the next slide. The dam is owned by the town of Milford. They had sovereign immunity and can't be sued for negligence. They had barriers and warnings above the dam to prevent canoeists from going over the dam. Note that the sign does not mention canoeists. There were chain link fences lining the sides of the dam, adorned with warning signs. Again, the warning signs don't mention canoeists. They had signs and barriers above and on the sides of the dam, but not below it. The barriers and signage were removed from the bottom of the dam prior to the incident. This made it easy to paddle up the backwash. So the question remains, with all the signs and barriers, why didn't the two youths conclude that the dam was dangerous? There were barriers to prevent going over the dam, but that didn't apply to them. The chain link fence prevented people from falling into the water. That didn't apply to them either. Perhaps the signs were a bluff and there was no real danger. Maybe they just wanted to keep people away from the dam. Who knows the real reason? What is clear is that the two canoeists didn't know the actual danger, which was a hydraulic below the dam, the drowning machine. The problem is that the signs indicate there is a danger, but they don't indicate what the actual danger is and why it is dangerous. Hence the need for interpretive signage. It explains the what, but more importantly, it communicates the why. Enter the interpretive sign. It explains what the hazard is and why it is dangerous. In addition, it tells you what you need to do to survive. It tells the story. The sign seeks to create understanding and appreciation. The first paragraph explains that low-head dams are dangerous, that they are killers, often called the drowning machine. But we have already noted this. The second paragraph tells the story of low-head dams. The hydraulic was created by design to prevent the undercutting of the dam. Unfortunately, it creates a perfect river-wide hydraulic that is a killer. This is how it kills you. The third paragraph tells you how to escape the hydraulic, but it is not without peril. Note that the second canoeist flushed out the bottom of the dam. Now you know why the dam is dangerous and why you don't want any part of it. Regarding the discussion, people observe that the interpretive sign will be effective. But will anyone read it? People don't read signs. However, over time, many people will read it and they will spread the word by word of mouth. Second, this sign complements other warning signs. It explains the why. For this reason, it should serve as a warning. Third, it is important to have multiple messaging that complements each other. Websites, brochures, the canoe rental can all have messages, posters, and signs regarding the dangers of the hydraulic behind the dam. The Potomac River study in 1991 was where I first utilized safety interpretation. 13 people drowned on the Potomac River in 1989, and the Maryland DNR wanted a study that would tell them what they needed to do to prevent fatalities in the future. The study studied fatalities, the hydrology of the river, and river users. We found a lot of interesting results. We called one result the drowning trap. For example, Potomac River users recognized that flood levels were dangerous. See the lower left graphic. The river was over its banks. It was muddy. Dead cows and propane tanks were floating down the river. However, River visitors didn't recognize the high water level when the river was still within its banks. See the lower right graphic. It didn't look dangerous. An easy giveaway of these higher flows is that the annual vegetation growing on the gravel bars during the summer low flows, as shown in the upper right graphic, become flooded as depicted in the lower right graphic. Most river users visited the river maybe once or twice a year. So long as the river was in its boundaries, it looked safe. Why not? It was not at flood level. This was a deceptive component of the drowning trap. As the water level increased, the depth of the river increased, and so did its velocity. Simply what happened was that there were high spring flows during the summer. And summer was when people came out and used the river. The higher water levels looked normal, but they weren't. Summer flows were normally low flows. The question we faced was how to communicate the drowning trap to Potomac River users. Our answer was an interpretive sign and an accompanying gauge. The gauge provides users with on-site information regarding the water level. The accompanying interpretive sign tells the story of what the drowning trap is and why it is dangerous. The sign addresses the who, what, where, when, and why questions. The first panels indicate what the drowning trap is. The second panels indicate why the drowning trap flows can harm you. They address the why. The third panel calls out and explains what you can do. Wear a life jacket or avoid the danger and stay off the river. The fourth panel indicates when the drowning trap flows occur. The gauge provides the information. Regarding the discussion questions, first, the interpretive sign is a point of entry sign. Hopefully, it communicates everything river users need to know. Second, it tells the story of the drowning trap and why it is important to you. It could save your life, and it explains why it is dangerous. Third, if the river were running at 6 feet, would this sign and gauge change your behavior? We didn't test the hypothesis, but you are more likely to believe that it could. Also, you have been warned. This is a kiosk and two interpretive signs at the put in on the Middle Youghiogheny River. Our focus is on one of the interpretive signs. The lower panel is titled Recommended Gear for Paddlers. The following is a sidebar regarding point of entry signs. The sign depicts some specialized gear the paddlers should have. When they arrive at this point of entry, are people who don't have this gear likely to abort their trip? Probably not. Perhaps they will obtain the necessary gear for the next time they come. So is the takeaway of the point of entry sign to change behavior for this trip or for future trips? Our focus is on who decides what is included or not included on the sign. The issue is whether to recommend carrying a knife or not to do so. You will note that the paddler is carrying a throw rope and the text recommends carrying one with you. If you look closely at the life jacket, the knife is airbrushed out of the picture and it isn't included as a recommended item. Normally, if you are around ropes, you should have a knife for extraction. The question is, which experts indicated who should or shouldn't carry a knife? It becomes a defensible position. As noted, if you are around loose ropes, you should probably carry a knife. The concept of educational triage was developed by this author from the user survey on the Potomac River study. Originally, borrowed from the medical community, the triage principle divides victims into three groups based on their survivability. Educational triage also divides users into three groups. The diagram applies educational triage to safety interpretation. For the first group, they know and appreciate the dangers and act appropriately. For this group, safety interpretation reinforces their existing behavior. For the second group, they do not know the dangers, but if given the appropriate information, they will attempt to behave appropriately. For this group, safety interpretation helps to change their actual behavior. If provided the safety information message, or for that matter, any safety message, the third group refuses to act appropriately. For this group, law enforcement is needed to change their behavior, if, in fact, it can be changed. The conclusion is that applying educational triage, safety interpretation reaches many but not all users. Also, it explains that there is a role for law enforcement. Barrier analysis originated in the 1970s and is used by major organizations like the Department of Energy, NASA, Department of Defense, Atomic Energy Commission, and the Army Corps of Engineers. This author introduced it into the outdoor field. Barrier analysis is fairly straightforward. Accidents are caused by an unwanted energy flow from a source to a target, resulting in injury, damage, or loss. You place barriers that are less than adequate between the source and the target to reduce the injury, damage, or loss. Barrier analysis is applied to the Ford Dam incident on the next slide. This slide applies barrier analysis to the Ford Dam incident. First, there is a source of the unwanted energy flow. The source can be from a wanted energy transfer, such as boiling water on the camp stove for coffee. However, knocking the stove and pot of boiling water over is an unwanted source of energy flow that could burn someone. In the Ford Dam incident, the dam and specifically the hydraulic below it are a source of unwanted energy flow. Recirculation in the hydraulic is the unwanted energy flow. The two canoeists or anyone else entering the hydraulic are the target. Drowning is the result, an accident or incident. There were numerous barriers present. They were all less than adequate or less than perfect. Unfortunately, they didn't stop the drowning in this case. First, there was a chain link fences which bordered the side of the dam. Second, there were warning signs of the danger, even though they didn't specify the danger or they didn't mention the danger, including canoeists either. Third, there were warning buoys. Most had warning signs on them. Fourth, if the interpretive sign was placed at the top of the portage trail, it too was a barrier that could have prevented injury, damage, or loss. As mentioned, the barriers were less than adequate, and there could be multiple causes contributing to the accident or incident. The signs don't need to be lengthy. They can include short stories. This is a National Park Service sign along the Potomac River. It tells a short story. Slipping on slippery rocks can spill you into the deadly currents of the Potomac River. Anyone can relate to slipping and the message. Note that the sign prohibits wading or swimming at the bottom of the sign. Compare and contrast the following two signs. What makes the water dangerous? The sign on the left doesn't tell you why the water is treacherous. The sign on the right does. Water passes through a strainer You don't. I like the colander analogy. It is graphic and makes the point. It should be noted that neither sign tells you what to do if you encounter treacherous waters or a strainer. But then, they are short stories. On the right is one of the numerous signs at the beginning of the Boise River Water Trail that goes through downtown Boise, Idaho. The call out notes that anyone under 14 must wear a life vest. In addition, Idaho law requires all vessels to have one life vest on board for each person. Do you see anything wrong or right with the random photo below? The life jackets are missing in the vessels, which in this case are tubes and rafts. The kids are wearing life jackets, but the adults aren't. And what is in the ice chest? This photo and the next slide provides us with a reality check. I provided the following slide as another reality check. From a safety point of view, some things simply don't change. Note the picture of the Shenandoah River in 1990 with the Boise River Trail taken in 2024. In both pictures, the kids are wearing life jackets, but the parents aren't. In both pictures, the adults don't have a life jacket in their tubes either. And in both pictures, what's in the coolers? Unfortunately, this brings us full circle. People ignore signs and messaging for whatever reason. The Potomac River sign says no swimming, yet there are swimmers in the background. Applying educational triage, there is a role for law enforcement. Again, this is a reality check. We are approaching the end of this presentation. An underlying question in safety is, how do we get people to act safely because they want to act safely? There is no easy answer to this question. However, safety interpretation is a tool in the safety toolbox. Also, it is a barrier in barrier analysis. It works, but not always. It is a less than adequate or not a perfect barrier. Also consider educational triage. It can reinforce behavior for those who are already behaving appropriately. Or it can change behavior for those who want to behave appropriately. However, there is also a role for law enforcement too. Consider safety interpretation signs as an upgrade from warning signs. They explain the what and the why. They tell the story, and in doing so, they relate to the participant. They move the participant and create revelation. Applying the basic paradigm through safety interpretation, there is understanding. Through understanding, there is appreciation. And through appreciation, there is safety. This brings us to the end of my formal presentation. If there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them. In addition, there are some QR codes which will take you to some of my YouTube videos on related topics to this presentation.